So, hello, this is a session on social policy and economic growth, organized by the Center for Economic Studies of El Colegio de Mexico. So welcome to the session. I'm Peter Hammond at the University of Warwick. So let me pass things over directly to the second speaker, Santiago Levy from the Inter-American Development Bank.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the Colegio de Mexico for this invited lecture. Let me begin by saying that it's great to share the speaking arrangement with Kaushik. Great friend for a long, long time, and we've shared some really nice experiences. The one that we're describing in Oaxaca was great fun about 3 years ago. And it's really very nice, Kaushik, and it's lovely to see you here at LACEA, and we hope to see you in many more LACEAs to come. So lovely to have you here. Kaushik and I spoke a little bit about how to divide the lecture, and Kaushik would speak a little bit more about the World Bank view. He shared that with us, and perhaps it made sense that I focus more on Latin America, and since that's sort of the area where I'm working today. This is mostly based on a paper that came out on the Journal of Economic Perspectives with Norbert Schady a couple of months ago. And it's difficult to focus with a very sharp conceptual framework on the relationship between social policy, economic growth, because there's so many interactions going in so many different ways. It goes in very many directions. So what I want to do is I'll focus basically on three broad areas that I think matter for the relationship between social policy and economic growth. I'll speak a little bit about human capital. I'll speak somewhat about social insurance and labor markets. And then I want to speak a little bit about transfer programs and poverty alleviation programs. Before I begin, the good news. The good news is that, so if you look at the last 15 years, there are really some good news to share. I mean, Latin America, the share of the population living in poverty with a $2.5 a day, the double the number that Kaushik was mentioning, came down for the region as a whole from 28 to 13%. The Gini coefficient came down from 0.55 to 0.5. Years of schooling have gone up. About a year per decade for the working population. Infant mortality is coming down. Pretty much any social indicator that you look at for poverty, education, has improved over the last 15 years. So there really are good news, and that's sort of the starting point. This is a combination, we would like to think, at least partly of a result of good policies, certainly of good macro, and a bit of good luck. Because the world international environment has been extremely generous to Latin America, particularly over the last decade. And I'll close my remarks by noting that if we look to the future, it's not so obvious that the world will be so generous to the region, and that perhaps that things have to go. The main point of my talk will be to argue that despite the good news, more of the same will not do. And that continuing along the line of policy that the region has been pushing over the last 15 years would be a mistake. And I want to argue for changing in some dimensions of social policy. So of the three areas that I spoke about, human capital, social insurance, and poverty programs and transfers, before I speak about the three, let me put them in context. If you think about growth in Latin America and compare the region with other regions of the world, the distinctive feature of the region is that even though all these indicators have been doing well on the social side, the growth indicators over the longer view are not so good. They're not so good if you compare them with other regions of the world, particularly East Asia. Even in this decade that was particularly good for Latin America, associated with the China boom and the commodity prices boom and very, very spectacular conditions in international capital markets, the growth rates are higher than the previous growth rates, but they're not spectacular. And if you ask yourself questions, why, the main reason behind that is not because the savings rate in Latin America is that low or because human capital accumulation is that much lower than other parts of the world. It is mostly because productivity growth has been low. If you look at numbers for the period 1980 to 2010, total factor productivity growth in Latin America for the region as a whole practically stagnated. And this is very much true also country by country. Almost every country that we look at, productivity growth over the last 30 years has stagnated. If you look at East Asia, over the same period, productivity growth increased by 60%. And if you look at the United States, productivity growth increased by 20%. So there's a huge gap. We don't really understand why, at least I don't understand why, but I will argue that social policy has to do, part of the explanation of this has to do with social policy. So let me begin now with that context, speaking about human capital. I'll divide that in two, schooling, and then I want to talk a little bit about human capital in the workforce and labor training. Great progress on enrollment rates and repetition rates and any almost indicator of coverage that you look at for Latin America over the last decades, great coverage. The bad news comes in when you ask questions about the quality of education. When you speak about the quality of education, the performance of Latin America is pretty dismal. And I'm not exaggerating when I use the word dismal. If you look at the PISA scores, and we don't have PISA scores for most countries in Latin America, but we do have for Argentina, for Brazil, for Chile, for Panama, for Peru, and for Uruguay. Among all these set of countries, the best performers are Chile and Uruguay. If you compare Chile with Singapore, only 5% of Chilean students will score as well as 50% of the students in Singapore. And only 1.5% of students in Chile will score as well as 50% of the students in Shanghai. And even if you take the top cream of the students and you say, let me just look at the PISA scores at the top part of the distribution for the ones with the highest income levels, those numbers don't change that much. Then in that case, you're looking at the best trained students in Chile, or the best schools in Chile, only about 10% of the students there will score as well as the average of all the students in Singapore or in Shanghai. So one first link that comes to mind in which we need to change is clearly issues of quality of education need to be put at the forefront. There's a complex link between the quality of education and productivity. There are papers by Hanušek and other people that claim that a great part of the gap in productivity that I was mentioning before is explained indeed by human capital considerations. I have some qualms with those papers, but nobody would quibble with the fact that if the quality of your human capital is not what it should be, you're not going to get the dynamic innovation and the sort of dynamic economies that you're going to need to sustain long-run growth. So first dimension is quality of education. For that, I think policy needs to focus a lot more in issues of early child development. Our generation of programs that focus on nutrition, the conditional cash transfer programs, paid little attention to that. And I think a lot more attention has to be focused on that, and a lot more attention has to be focused on issues of quality of teachers. Many of you here in this room have contributed to those papers. Many of you have produced for that. And that's an active area of research. A second area of research, which I think is somewhat underestimated in my view, has to do with the fact that we tend to associate measures of human capital with schooling, and we tend to think about human capital and schooling and look at quality of schooling, and we're talking here between, I don't know, ages 3 to ages 18, maybe ages 24. But even if Latin America did a wonderfully successful educational reform, and as of tomorrow morning the quality of education began to improve, it's going to take quite some time before that permeates into the economy, because the cohorts of people will begin to move year by year by year by year. The fact of the matter is that the stock of the labor force that you currently have there is the stock of the labor force that's going to be there for the next 20 to 30 years as various cohorts retire and the new cohorts come in. And so there are issues there about what is it that you can gain in terms of human capital with the current labor force, which is not going to benefit from improvements in schooling programs. But there's a lot of space for them to acquire skills. And we don't know enough and we don't understand enough here as to skill acquisition and acquisition of human capital in the jobs. This is, I suggest for this crowd in LACEA, an area that should receive a lot more attention. We tend to think of skills as a scalar that is measured somehow. In many papers, we tend to associate skills with the PISA score. We have very little data about measurement of skills for the labor force. There are these PICA numbers that are about to come up, but we don't even have them. And if you wrote a function of skills production, you would say, well, yeah, I'm going to write skills production as a function of schooling, but also type of job. Clearly, if you didn't get a lot of schooling, you're not going to be a NASA engineer. But it's also the case that if you have 4 or 5 years of school, or 7 years of school, which is about the average for a Latin American worker, it does matter whether you come in and out of jobs continuously, erratically during your life cycle as a worker, or you enter into a stable job, and there you're trained by the firm, you can acquire skills, and then throughout your life skills, you can make up for some of the skills that you didn't get in schooling. So I think there's a lot of potential gains and a lot of good things that social policy understood of human capital formation, in particular the ages from 25 to 45 or ages to 25 to 50, could do to promote economic growth, which is not a substitute but a complement to the huge effort that needs to be done in the quality of schooling. As I speak about jobs, leads me naturally to the second area that I wanted to focus about, which was labor markets and social insurance. Social insurance is a big component of social policy in Latin America. I don't know, maybe this is something they distinguish from Africa, from India. I don't know enough about those other areas, but certainly it's a big component. If you think about the amount of money that governments spend on this, on pensions and health and all that, it is big. And of course, in Latin America, when you speak about social insurance, the elephant in the room is the segmentation of social insurance and the informal sector. So a couple of numbers. 55% of the labor force of the region is in the informal sector. You have some outliers that have a very small informal sector, Chile and Uruguay, but these are the outliers. Even large countries like Brazil, Mexico will have about half of the labor force in the informal sector, and other countries 60 to 70%. Large share of informal firms, which goes together with informal employment. And by some measures, and there's some reports coming out, Eduardo Lora has a book coming out on that, I think the CAF has a report on that, I think the World Bank LACEA reports on that. Too many people that should be salaried employees being either entrepreneurs or excessive entrepreneurship, excessive self-employment. So this has to do something with social insurance, and has to do something, if we properly understand social insurance, as incorporating what some other people label labor regulations, but I don't like to label them labor regulations, the sort of things that Kashik was speaking about tenure in the job and all that, are really social insurance because we don't have proper unemployment insurance, and they're substituting for a protection for output shocks. So there's big discussion about informality in the area. If you rule out a genetic explanation, if you rule out that the Latin American DNA has an extra chromosome that generates informality, this has to do with incentives. This has to do with the set of incentives that workers and firms face. And these incentives are multiple. They can come incentives from the tax side, they can come incentives from the area of credit, they can come incentives from transaction costs and whatnot. But clearly, workers and firms face incentives in the labor market that are very much affected by the structure of social insurance, including labor regulations. And so social insurance has to do with informality. This matters a lot for growth, and this is a second big link. I spoke earlier about the human capital. Matters a lot for growth because there's plenty of evidence that productivity in the informal sector is less than productivity in the formal sector. I mean, just write, TFP is alpha of TFP in the formal sector plus 1 minus alpha of TFP in the informal sector. And if 1 minus alpha is big, even if you have a very dynamic formal sector, you have a huge drag on TFP growth in the whole economy because you have a large informal sector that's dragging everything down. So understanding now the links between social insurance, informality, and productivity becomes central from understanding to what extent social policy contributes or doesn't contribute, in fact hinders, productivity growth and therefore economic growth in the region. And this has to do a lot with the dichotomous or segmented structure of social insurance. As we all know, the formal guys pay social insurance from wage-based taxes. This is called contributory. The informal guys don't get formal insurance from wage-based taxes, but increasingly in the region, they get substitute health, pension, and other related programs that are paid from general revenues. Depending on parameters of workers' valuations for the structure of these programs and depending on the way how much fluidity is in the market, this what we'll do is we'll translate into a structure of taxes on formality and subsidies to informality. This is very bad social policy because if workers are transiting between the formal and the informal sector, sometimes they're covered by some risks and sometimes they're not covered by some risks. The same guy with the same human capital, sometimes protected, sometimes not. Very bad for pensions because people only save part of the working life, replacements are going to be low, but also very bad for growth and productivity. Many people in this room have written papers now, and there's an increasing amount of accumulating evidence from randomized controls and very well done papers that do show that these non-contributory programs, either on pensions or on health, are affecting worker and firms' choices, and de facto are having a positive impact on informal employment. So that there's a reallocation of factors of production exactly in the direction in which you don't want to go. There are nice papers for Colombia, there are nice papers for Mexico, there's some nice papers from Argentina, I don't have time to quote them, but there's a growing literature that says, yes, indeed, this is not a theoretical presupposition, the empirical evidence that we're beginning to collect shows that this is there. And this brings then an area in which social policy, in this particular case social insurance, matters a lot for growth, and we have this dilemma in which, yes, we are providing health benefits to people who otherwise would not have them, and this is important, and this is good and welcome. Yes, we're providing coverage against old age poverty. This is, again, good and welcome. It's also reducing inequality, which is welcome as well. But it is coming at some productivity cost that maybe the region cannot reinforce. And the question here is whether changes in social policy, and that's why I'm arguing for that, in this particular case in social insurance, need to be seen through the future as functioning in a different mechanism if we want to increase productivity growth and ensure that this is more sustainable in the medium term. There are also potential negative effects, and another area that I think has received not so much attention and I think should be put back on the agenda of research, and hopefully some people here in LACEA can do some work on that as well, which is savings. A lot of work on savings in Latin America in the early 1990s when Latin America was doing the pension reforms, going from the pay-as-you-goes to the defined contribution systems. A lot of questions whether it was Ricardian equivalence or no one-to-one, and it was offset or not going to be offset. And then kind of that has sort of faded a little bit. But we're still left with pension systems in which only 30, 40, 50% of the labor force is being forced to save. If there's no one-to-one Ricardian equivalence, and in fact the offset is not one from savings to voluntary savings, then there must be some impact on aggregate savings. And we don't know enough as to whether all these non-contributory pensions that are providing pensions for people who never saved, what are they doing to the incentives to save, and what are they doing to aggregate savings? And savings matter for growth unless you have in your mind a model in which, full capital mobility and all that, which is not the world in which Latin America has been inhabiting over the last 30 years, is a very different world. So savings is yet another channel, aside from factor reallocation, in which we need to think differently if we want to increase the volume of savings, particularly if we think that in the next decade, the world is not going to be as generous to Latin America as it has been, and access to international capital markets is not going to be on easiest terms as it has been over the past. To sum up the issue in social insurance, there's an interaction there between human capital, schooling plus labor skills, distribution of skills, incentives providing from social insurance, and other factors that is generating size distribution of firm and a type distribution of firm which is very little conducive to economic growth. And that is the area that I think needs to change as we look forward. Let me move on to the third area which I think is relevant on social policy, which has to do with transfers and poverty alleviation programs. CCTs was a Latin American innovation, these transfer programs. I think the balance of the evidence that has been collected from many RCTs and similar exercises is clearly positive that these transfer programs have worked well in reducing income poverty, and they've had a positive impact on some dimensions of human capital, and this is as it was thought, as an investment in the human capital of the poor that would eventually allow them to enter into the labor market in better conditions. The evidence that we have as to what is happening to deeper indications of human capital are not so good. Yes, children are going more to school. It's not obvious they're learning more. And they're acquiring really more cognitive skills. More work needs to be done on the supply, and I think attention needs to be shifted from just the transfer to the quality of the services that is being given, particularly the educational service and the health services. But more importantly, I think we haven't thought enough about the incentive compatibility issues that arise between transfer programs and social insurance programs. So let me give you my perfect caricature of what I think when CCTs were thought about 15 years ago, we're going to do. They were going to ensure that the mother during pregnancy was well fed, so that the child had the right weight at birth, and that through nutritional supplements and medical attention, that baby was not going to suffer nutrition, and was going to be moving along and then enrolling in school, and with school scholarship is going to enter and end up at age 18, now with more years schooling compared to his parents. and that these investments in human capital in the poor through the CCTs were going to yield a higher return. But now they're entering into a labor market that is increasingly distorted by social insurance, and in particular, if non-contributory social insurance programs targeted to some extent on the poor induce them more into the informal sector, the expected returns to the investments in education are probably not going to materialize. We're now at the point in which the cohorts of various generations of CCTs are entering the labor market. These programs began in 97, 98 in Colombia, Mexico, Brazil at different points, and now we can begin to pick up whether these programs are having the effect that they should be having. And I hope I'm wrong. I'm not optimistic that in fact these investments are going to translate into higher returns, but this is an area of research. But the point I'm bringing here is the incentive compatibility of these programs need to be thought. And this is yet another link between productivity and growth. We also need more research on what is the impact of all these programs on participation rates. If you look at some of these programs, the size of the transfers in some countries in the region has increased importantly over the last few years. Transfers now are in some cases 30, 40% of family household income. Something must happen to labor leisure choices and to participation rates when you're having such high transfers. And he speaks about some limit at some point that you can reach when you're hitting about redistribution. One last point about transfers, and I'll connect a little bit to the lecture of this morning from Kaushik. They've benefited immensely from all these randomized controls trials, but we've put a lot of attention on evaluating individual programs. When I speak about the incentive compatibility between an individual CCT and then a non-contributory program in health, or a non-contributory program in pensions, and a contributory program in health or in pensions that taxes formal employment, what I'm speaking about here is that there's an incentive compatibility between the two things, and we should evaluate the whole thing and not the individual program. And we need to develop methodologies. It's not easy, and I don't think RCTs are going to be the answer to this, and I very much agree with your remarks this morning. We're going to need to develop new methodologies to evaluate these things. So I conclude. 1995 to 2010, 2011, a success story in social policy in Latin America, and I think this is all to the good. Some of it associated with good luck, not clear that this will be the years ahead. But I think that more of the same would not do. I don't think we can just continue increasing transfers, increasing the coverage of these programs. I don't think that more non-contributory pensions or non-contributory health. I need to think about new architecture of social insurance, and we have to think about new methods of investing in human capital if social policy indeed is going to make the contribution to growth that it won't be. If growth in the decades, in the next decade, is not so fast in Latin America for regions alien to the region, because China slows down or whatever you want, commodity prices slow down, we need to begin to think about the fiscal sustainability of all this. And unless there's economic growth, even the social policy that we've laid out, in some cases and at some point, is going to begin to hit fiscal constraints that's going to make it sustainable. So if only for fiscal reasons, we need to begin to change, but for deeper reasons, we need to change, because now we need to move into a social policy that is more focused on productivity, more focused on incentives, and more focused on determinants of long-term growth. Stop here. Thank you.